The Malaise on the Left by Maurice Brinton. Forget for a moment the scare campaigns of the recent elections. Scanlon and Jones presented by the yellow press as proselytizers of Red Revolution. Mr. Wilson in the garb of a latter-day Kerensky opening the gates to Bolshevism or worse. Bank clerks freezing the funds of fleeting fascists. A la Portuguese. I don't know what the fuck that says. The great fear of the bourgeoisie about a, quote, mafia of fanatical socialists, end quote, in control of the commanding heights of the National Executive Committee of the Labor Party. The reality is less lurid and less encouraging. What we see around us is a confident and aggressive movement, increasingly aware of the fact that real power does not lie in Parliament, but profoundly divided as to objectives, strategies, and tactics, and completely at sea as to values and priorities. So divergent are its component strands that one has to ask quite bluntly whether one can legitimately speak of a movement. Among thinking socialists there is a deep malaise. The purpose of this article is to explore the roots of this malaise and to show that they lie in the transformation of class society itself. Over the last few decades, and in more different areas, established society has itself brought about the number of the things that the revolutionaries of yesterday were demanding. This has happened in relation to economic attitudes, in relation to certain forms of social organization, and in relation to various aspects of the personal and sexual revolutions. When this adaptation in fact benefits established society, is it legitimate to refer to it as a, quote, recuperation, end quote. This article seeks to start a discussion on the limits of recuperation. Footnote: The discussion is whether to, quote, self-management, end quote, can be equated with, quote, socialism, end quote, has already begun among libertarians on the continent. End footnote. Recuperation, of course, is nothing new. What is perhaps new is the extent to which most, quote, revolutionaries, end quote, whether they be demanding, quote, more nationalization, end quote, more, quote, self-management, end quote, or more, quote, personal freedom, end quote, are unaware of the system's ability to absorb and in the long run benefit from these forms of, quote, dissent, end quote. Class society has a tremendous resilience, a great capacity to cope with, quote, subversion, to make icons of its iconoclasts, to draw sustenance from those who would throttle it. Revolutionaries must constantly be aware of this strength, otherwise they will fail to see what is happening around them. If certain sacred cows or certain previous formulations now found to be inadequate have to be sacrificed, we'd rather do the job ourselves. Recuperation of economic demands. Keynesian economic policies, once considered radical threats to bourgeois society, are today widely accepted as essential to the functioning of modern capitalism. The demands for nationalization of the mines or railways, for national health insurance, for unemployment benefits, and for state pensions have been totally recuperated. Despite occasional nostalgic and largely irrelevant glances into the past, no conservative politicians seeking to retain a shred of credibility would today advocate the return of the mines or of the railways to private ownership, or the dismantling of the essential structure of the quote, welfare, end quote, state. All socialists would agree, thus far. But there is then a parting of the ways. We would claim that the centralization of the means of production in the hands of the state, the most, quote, radical, end quote, demand of the Communist Manifesto, has been achieved in many parts of the world without any corresponding enhancement in the areas of human freedom. In fact, an exploiting society divided into order givers and order takers functions far better on this type of economic basis, which eliminates many of the irrationalities of laissez-faire capitalism. Whatever the human aspirations of their rank and file, the ideologies and programs of social democratic, communist, Trotskyist, or Maoist groups in the West provide the most articulate demands of this kind of social organization. These groups are the midwives of state capitalism. They may differ as to tempo and as to tactics. They may argue about what they consider to be, for others, the acceptable or unacceptable costs. But their fundamental objective is the same, and is moreover in keeping with the deepest requirements of capital itself. Pace the ghosts of Hayek or Schumpeter, pace Enoch Powell and Keith Joseph. The division of society into rulers and ruled will not be abolished by the abolition of the, quote, free market, end quote, or for that matter, by anything that Messrs. Wilson or Golan or the, quote, theoreticians, end quote, of any of the Marxist sects may have in mind. Moreover, all over the Third World, from Sakau, Therese, Guinea to North Vietnam, from Iraq to Zanzibar, quote, Marxist-Leninist, end quote, ideas are today influencing the birth and molding the economic life of many developing countries. All are ruthlessly exploitative societies geared to the rapid development of the productive forces. Today, this is only possible on the basis of intense primary accumulation carried out on the backs of the peasantry. Here again, erstwhile revolutionary ideas are becoming vehicles for new forms of enslavement. To paraphrase Marx, it is not what men think they are doing that matters. What matters is the objective results of their beliefs and actions. Class society can well recuperate the economic demands of the traditional left. It is not of fundamental importance in this respect whether the various ruling classes are fully aware of what is happening to them. They clearly differ from one another in the degree of insight they have achieved into their own long-term historical interests. The more far-sighted among them accept the centralization of the means of production in the hands of the state as the essential precondition for the growth of the productive forces. For most Marxist socialists and for the bourgeoisie, this growth is the fundamental issue. This is what unites them. This is where the bourgeois vision and the Marxist vision coalesce. For both of them, economic growth is what politics and ultimately what life itself is all about. There are few other dimensions to their thinking. For both of them, the future is mainly about, quote, more of the same, end quote, and the rest? The rest is for, quote, after the revolution, end quote. At best, it will look after itself. At worst, if one speaks to a traditional Marxist about such issues as women's liberation, ecology, the, quote, counterculture, end quote, etc., one is denounced as a, quote, diversionist, end quote, in tones showing how deeply the work ethic, patriarchal attitudes, and the value system of the existing society have permeated their thinking. Recuperation of institutional forms. Sections of the left have fortunately gone far beyond the demands for nationalization, planning, etc. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, small groups of, quote, left, end quote, communists clearly foresaw the course of events which this type of, quote, socialism, end quote, would lead to. Slandered by Lenin, denounced by the, quote, orthodox, end quote, communists, they warned of what lay ahead. The rule of the party would soon result in the emergence of a new ruling class based not on the private ownership of the means of production, but on a monopoly of decisional authority in all areas of economic and social life. To the hegemony of the party and to the omniscience of its central committee, the left communists counterposed the knowledge and power of an enlightened and autonomous working class. They posited the institutional form this power would take, the workers' councils. This was no genial blueprint for a new society sucked out of the thumb of a Gorder or a Pannekoek. From the Paris Commune to the Russian Revolution of 1917, the, quote, council, end quote, form of organization had been the living historical product of the class struggle itself. The warnings of these earlier revolutionaries had been fully justified, but their vision remains limited. Despite Pannekoek's interest in science and philosophy, Rula's interest in pedagogy, and Corse's stress on the need for a deep-going cultural critique, most of the writings of the left communists centered on problems of work and production and distribution. They lived in a very different era from our own and had little of significance to say about what have become very important areas of social life: bureaucratization, alienation in consumption and leisure, authoritarian conditioning, the quote, youth revolt, end quote, women's liberation, etc. Some of their institutional proposals have been partly overtaken. Even some of their institutional proposals have been partly overtaken by events. The recuperation of the demand for working class power at the point of production in society, the recuperation of the demand for working class power at the point of production and for a society based on workers' councils has, for instance, taken on a particularly sinister form. Confronted with the bureaucratic monstrosity of Stalinist and post-Stalinist Russia, yet wishing to retain some credibility among their working class supporters, various strands of Bolshevism have sought posthumously to rehabilitate the concept of, quote, workers' control, end quote. Although, quote, workers' control, end quote, was only referred to once in the documents of the first four Congresses of the Communist International, it has recently become one of the top 10 slogans. Between 1917 and 1921, all attempts by the working class to assert real power over production, or to transcend the narrow role allocated to it by the party, were smashed by the Bolsheviks, after first having been denounced as anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist deviations. Today, workers' control is presented as a sort of sugarcoating to the pill of nationalization of every Trotskyist or Leninist micro-bureaucrat on the make. Those who strangled the viable infant are now hawking the corpse around. The Institute for Workers' Control even runs annual conferences addressed and dominated by trade union officials appointed for life. Those who are not prepared to allow workers to control their own organizations here and now serenade sundry simpletons with fanciful tunes as to their fate in the future. Recuperation is here taking place amid incredible confusion. For a long time, the advocacy of genuine workers' control, or as we prefer to call it, workers' self-management. Footnote. For a discussion about the differences between the two concepts, see the introduction to the Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, 1917 to 1921. End footnote. For a long time, the advocacy of genuine workers' control, or as we prefer to call it, workers' self-management, remained confined to small groups of revolutionaries swimming against the great bureaucratic tide. Following the French events of May 1968, the demand took on a new reality and a new coherence. People began to see self-management as the dominant theme and workers' councils as the institutional form of a new society in which bureaucracy would be eliminated and in which ordinary people would at last achieve genuine power over many aspects of their everyday life. But this again was to ignore the system's capacity for integrating dissent and harnessing it to its own advantage. Can the demand for self-management be geared to the requirements of class society itself? An honest answer would be, quote, yes, in some respects, end quote. Yes, providing those operating the self-management still accepted the values of the system. Yes, if it remained strictly localized. Yes, provided it was eviscerated of all political content. Car assembly plants seeking to obtain the participation of workers have been operating for some time in the Volvo and Saab factories in Sweden. Under the, quote, with it, end quote, guise of enriching the worker's job, employers have continued to enrich themselves. Groups of workers are allowed to manage their own alienation. The powers that be seek to resuscitate the anemic institutions of existing society, increasingly abandoned by those expected to make them function, with transfusions of, quote, participation, end quote. No wonder the slogan has been taken up by everyone from Gaullist deputies to our own liberals. Revolutionaries are in some measure to blame for this confusion of form and content. Revolutionaries have insufficiently warned against the dangers inherent in any attempt at self-management with capitalism. And in relation to the demand, they have insufficiently stressed the limitations of demand. Self-management and workers' councils are means to liberation. They are not liberation itself. Many revolutionaries have, moreover, tended to underestimate the complex problems of society as a whole. These have to be considered in addition to the problems of particular groups of workers. Our vision has never been, quote, the railways to the railwaymen, the dust to the dustmen, end quote. We are not for self-managed insurance empires, for self-managed advertising companies, for the self-managed production of nuclear weapons. This is not to say that self-management will not be the dominant theme and the council probably the institutional form of any kind of socialist society, but they are no more than that. Into those particular bottles many wines can be poured. In contemporary society, self-management could very well develop on a reformist, racist, nationalistic, or militaristic basis. The historical precedents are here. Many workers' councils in Germany in December 1918 and again later on voted to surrender power to parliamentary institutions. Between 1930 and 1945, the vast majority of the British and German people identified with their respective rulers and mobilized themselves, or allowed themselves to be mobilized in the defense of the interests of what were not their own. Israeli self-managed kibbutzim are vehicles for the dissemination of Zionist ideology and for implementing anti-Arab discrimination, i.e. anti-socialist policies. In Northern Ireland, amid a, quote, unparalleled explosion of self-management, end quote, the self-activity of a civilian population recently brought down a government in the name of sectarian and mystified objectives. The lessons are clear. Self-management divorced from socialist politics is meaningless. This is a very important essay. So these are points that people discuss currently as if they're profound, but this was written in, or published in, 1974. Good stuff here. Good stuff. All right, kids, let's keep going. Recuperation of, quote, proto-Marxist, end quote, demands. Confronted with the fact that established society has successfully co-opted both the economic objectives and some of the institutional prescriptions of those who want to challenge it, radicals have responded in a number of ways. One response has been to delve deeper into Marx. This, quote, communist project, end quote, is redefined in proto-Marxist terms. We now have Marx a la carte. What is stressed is not what was the historical reality of Marxism, even in Marx's day, but a vision which, although valid, seldom went beyond the realm of rhetoric. The Marx of the, quote, proletarians have no fatherland, end quote, replaces the Marx of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, who supported first Bismarck's armies, then, after Sedan, the forces of the Second Empire. The Marx who denounced the slogan, quote, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, end quote, arguing instead for the, quote, abolition of the wages system, end quote, replaces the more prosaic Marx maneuvering amongst the Lucrofts and the Maltman Berries in the councils of the First International. The Marx who thundered that, quote, the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself, end quote, erases the pathetic figure of the Marx of 1872, cooking the last Congress of the International, the only one he attended in person, inventing non-existing delegations, shifting the venues of future meetings to harass the supporters of the equally authoritarian Bakunin. But are even these proto-Marxist prescriptions adequate? Is the, quote, abolition of frontiers any kind of guarantee as to the type of regime that will hold sway over the new frontierless expanse? Is the vision of an exploitative society, fusing the techniques of domination of both East and West, just a nightmare dreamed up by the writers of science fiction? Is the abolition of the wage labor any guarantee against exploitation and alienation? Were there non-exploitative societies long before wage labor appeared on the historical scene? Wage labor underpins and reinforces hierarchies of power. Its abolition does not necessarily abolish such hierarchies. Class society might even recuperate demands of this kind. Recuperation of the, quote, personal revolution, end quote. Another response of those confronted with the tremendous recuperative powers of established society has been a tendency to seek individual emancipation, to create in the, quote, here and now, end quote, microcosms of the alternative society. Some advocates of this viewpoint see the growth of social freedom as the byproduct of the addition of one, quote, free, end quote, individual to another, rather like workers going to Ruskin College to become, quote, emancipated one by one. end quote. This type of revolt, as long as it is conceived in purely individual terms, can readily be recuperated by established society. Individual revolt, whether in clothing or in hairstyles, whether in food preferences or in musical tastes, whether in sexual mores or in the philosophical attitudes, readily becomes a commodity to be frenetically exploited in the interest of capital itself. The important book, The Failure of the Sexual Revolution by George Frankl, deals with this theme. Let me get a sip of drink here. Let me get a drink. Let me get a swig of this juice. Ugh. It's not juice, it's water. I'm very health conscious. Until about 10 o'clock at night, then I'm no longer health conscious. Limits of recuperation. In the Irrational in Politics, a book which I've made an audio book of. It's on the YouTube channel. We wrote that exploiting society would not be able to tolerate, quote, the mass development of critical, demystified, self-reliant, sexually emancipated, autonomous, non-alienated persons conscious of what they want and prepared to struggle for it, end quote. We still hold this idea to be basically correct. Its core that one cannot conceive of any genuinely liberatory movement without genuinely liberated individuals seems irrefutable, but our formulation was inadequate. We should have spoken of individuals prepared collectively to struggle with what they want, and we should have spoken more about the objectives of the struggle. We should have described more clearly what the vision was, in our eyes at least. The socialist transformation of society is not an automatic process or a reflex activity. The socialist transformation of society requires a sense of direction. There may be many roads to the promised land, but it can surely only help if people know where they are going. Let us take it for granted that meaningful activity needs to be collective, that social transformation needs emancipated individuals, and that the institutional framework of any new society will probably be based, in part at least, on those forms which the struggle itself has repeatedly thrown up at its moments of deepest insight and creativity. What we now need to think about and to discuss widely throughout the libertarian left is the political content of an activity that consciously seeks both to avoid recuperation and to be relevant to the conditions of today. Are certain yardsticks necessary to define such an activity? I personally think the answer is, quote, yes, end quote, with the proviso that the definition must be seen as an ongoing process. Should revolutionaries who share common objectives group together, first to discuss their objectives and then to fight for them? Again, I think the answer is, quote, yes, end quote. Quote, political inexistentialism, end quote, is only relevant if one thinks there is some divine guidance ensuring that every struggle helps move society in a socialist direction. It is only if libertarians speak openly about these questions that they will be able to present a credible alternative to the authoritarian left. If socialism is the creation of forms of living that will enable all, free from external constraints or internalized inhibitions, to rise to their full stature, to fulfill themselves as human beings, to enjoy themselves, to relate to one another without treading on anybody, and this is as good a definition of socialism as any other, we should say loud and clear. We should say so loud and clear. We would not be afraid of criticizing any activities, however, quote, self-managed, end quote, that lead in an opposite direction. Socialism, after all, is about a specific way of socializing. In this discussion, we must not forget the economic prerequisites of what we seek, nor must we confuse them with the objective itself. Finally, we must not underestimate the forces we are up against, including the recuperative powers of established society. An ongoing reassessment of the degree to which one's former goals have been recuperated is the most effective antidote to the malaise on the left, and the only possible prescription for remaining a revolutionary. Solidarity, Volume 7, Issue 12, November 1974.